Do you look awful in regular shorts? That's because they're made of a stiff cotton. They're literally not made to move at all. This means a baggy, boxy, unflattering cut on every leg. Bird Dog shorts fixed all that. They invented cloud knit khaki fabric. It looks just like khaki, but it stretches. You get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. You never thought shorts could look this good. Go to birddogs.com/pool and grab a pair before they sell out for the summer. They'll even throw in a free Yeti-style tumbler. That's birddogs.com/pool.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring an in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. We're here to talk about the venues of the Big Ten and which are the best, which are the worst, or at least which are the hardest and which are the easiest. And so before we start the discussion, just want to remind you that you are what makes us so great. You're the ones who make our show so popular. It's top 100 basketball podcast in America, largely because of you. And so because of that, I'd like to thank you and also encourage you to continue spreading the show with your friends, other Spartan fans, people who might be interested in the show. And, maybe get them on to the Jay Billis episode, or Robbie Hummel, or Mike DeCourcy, or certainly any of the pregame and postgame analysis, especially once we get closer to the basketball season. And this extra content is what we do for you because we enjoy talking hoops, even when it's spring outside, or now it feels like summer. So let's get right into it, Rod, here. We'll start with the venues that you have ranked from the toughest. Well, we'll start from the easiest to the toughest. So we'll start backwards. So Bryce Jordan, Welsh Ryan, Pinnacle Bank Arena, Chrysler, Value City, Williams Arena, Carver Hawkeye. And then for the top 7, the Rack, Xfinity Center, State Farm, Cole, Assembly Hall, Breslin, and Mackey. So I guess let's start with the easiest venue, which is Bryce Jordan, or AKA the Catacombs out in Penn State and State College.
Yeah, and look, just as a preface to this is obviously a subjective read of these things. You can be splitting hairs, and you'll see as we go. There are some tough calls where there's certainly room for debate. I don't think there's much room for debate on this one, though.
No,
It's really interesting. They built Bryce Jordan. I didn't look it up to see the exact year it debuted, but I want to say not long after they joined the Big Ten. So mid-90s that it debuted, I'm pretty sure. And my understanding, I've not been to a game there, candidly, but my understanding is, and you can kind of see it when you see the games on TV, it was modeled very much after Breslin. There's a lot of that goes on in stadium construction, is that if there's a successful, what's perceived to be a successful design, other schools or even in the pro ranks, they do this. They'll use those successful designs as templates. And so that's my understanding. Of course, one big difference between those two buildings is the Breslin Center actually has bodies in it. Bryce Jordan is the closest thing I think we get to what the COVID experience was. And that really is, I say it's the easiest venue, but in one sense it's not. If you're, and obviously guys who have actually played in these games as opposed to us in these buildings would know even better. But I think it's fair to say that when you're playing in a hostile environment, let's say you're playing a game in Champaign or, Iowa City, wherever you want to pick, as a visiting team, you can use that hostility from the crowd as fuel. And we see that from time to time in certain players. I mean, Scott Skiles was a classic example of that. Scott Skiles would play better as the crowd got on him more and more vociferously. The issue at Bryce Jordan is you really have to find a way to manufacture your own emotion, because it's not going to come from the crowd, really. It's just, and I don't know what can change it other than the easy answer, which is well-sustained success. But even that, I just don't know. Penn State is the classic example of a football school. Its football audience is tremendous. You look at, people talk, if we were doing this ranking for football stadiums, it might be the polar opposite. I mean, I think people, again, can have differing opinions, but there would at least be an argument for Penn State to be as tough a venue in football as you can play in the Big Ten for a visiting team, from a visiting team's perspective. Yeah. So it's a great fan base for football. Basketball has just not been there, and that's down to a lot of things. I think it's down first and foremost to a lack of a tradition of great success. But I also think, Western Pennsylvania, and it's not Western Pennsylvania. I guess it's that would be more Pitt, central Pennsylvania. Yeah. But the state of Pennsylvania, let's say that, outside of Philadelphia, is not a great basketball state. That doesn't mean it doesn't produce talent, but it's not. My impression has been it doesn't compare to Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana as Big Ten states where basketball really does matter to one degree or another. It's not quite the same level. And so I think the fan base reflects that, So when you put those two things together, you don't have basketball as religion, or at least as something, a pastime people care about very much in the area to start with. And then on top of that, you're not even giving them an excuse to come see it because you're not winning very much. It's a tough deal. I mean, they had as not just that they were good, but Penn State this year was as aesthetically entertaining a team as there was, in my opinion, in college basketball. They played a weird, unique style with very different kinds of players. And I mean, Jared Pickett operating, Jalen Pickett, operating as a post player at 6'4". And nominally a point guard, but he's also your best post-up guy. I mean, it was just Funk with the quickest, wildest release in the game, at least outside of Tamanaga. They were really entertaining, and yet I didn't have the impression that the crowds were markedly better than we typically see. So I have to put them last. I mean, just for those reasons, I don't think many people would differ with that. And that's going to be a real challenge. The new coach, Mike Rhodes, probably one of the first things I would think any coach coming into that program thinks is they've got to find a way to turn that into a home court advantage. That's challenging.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I look at that and I think it harkens back to Rutgers when they first joined the league. I don't think Rutgers was a particularly difficult place to play in that, but I think they sort of made it more fun maybe for the students, but I think really it's getting, to be honest, I think the reason, say, Breslin is so good and many of the venues is because of the intense student engagement in these games.
Well, and we'll talk about that as we go through it, because I think that is a separator between certain places, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. And I just think, like, if you're Penn State, it absolutely makes sense to me to maybe not give away the tickets, but pretty much give away the tickets and get as many students, because I noticed this last year, and maybe it's just my guess, but my impression is that people are looking for more in-person experiences than they were in the past. I know for a while we're like, well, with high definition TV and stuff, people are not interested in going to games and this sorts of things. But I feel like that has turned in the last year or so. And I think in some respects, I think it's because people are seeking, social contact with other people. And so I think there's an opportunity, especially with indoors, when you're not worried about weather and things like that, you sit in the rain, you might be able to get some, engagement from your students. And because that's what can really totally turn around an atmosphere, because if they're excited, even if you're not crazy in your seats when you're like 45 years old, it's just more enjoyable going to a game if there's energy in the building,
The other suggestion I would make to them, and this is more of an aesthetic one, but
these are free, by the way, Penn State administration.
At least it's the way it comes across on television. One other big difference between that building and Breslin is the way that they're lit. Breslin is bright, and so the whole lower bowl is always bright, and it just I think that the dark move can work in certain places. We'll talk about this as we get into the upper end of the list. Places like Illinois, or especially Mackey, where they used to be just, I mean, it used to be even more extreme than it is now. When you would watch a game on television, the court would be lit and that was it. Everything else was pitch black, but you could hear them. That was really intimidating. But if you don't have the bodies, and it's also, it was a problem that Michigan had for years with Chrysler, and they altered their lighting a little bit. And I think it helped. If you don't have just an automatic sellout rabid atmosphere, changing the lighting. Penn State is just always kind of dark but not pitch black, just kind of dire.
It feels like a storage closet you walked into.
Yeah.
It's empty, but it's kind of dim.
And so I would maybe look at that too. But anyway, they're clearly the worst. I don't think this one's up for debate.
Do you think and I don't know what UCLA and UCUSC's, I think in general we feel like their fan bases are not rabid sports
UCLA basketball
competitions in general.
UCLA basketball is kind of an outlier because it can be good, but it seems to vary some. As most things sports wise do in Southern California. But anyway,
I wonder when USC joins, if where it'll end up here. But well, let's move on to number 13, which is Welsh Ryan Northwestern, and this is a venue that was, I mean, as most places in Chicago, when you have a small alumni base, as Northwestern does, and you have large alumni bases, these huge state public universities, you don't have very good athletic tradition. It's easy to get tickets. It's easy to flood these arenas and become sort of almost a home away from home sort of situation. That happened many times at Northwestern, although I feel like the end of the season, it changed a little bit, but
for sure,
that's definitely been sort of their history.
I think this year signified something of a breakthrough for them. Now, can they sustain it? That's a question, but I thought their atmosphere in the back half of Big Ten play was really good. You're right. What the problem is, there's some things that are good about it. It's a smaller venue, which by the way, is one of the things that really helps the RAC. If you've got a smaller venue and you start engaging the fan base to fill it, those buildings can become instantly tougher to play in because the sound reverberates a little better, or it tends to. So the acoustics make it tougher. It just feels like they're more on top of you. So Welsh Ryan has some things to like about it. They recently, just a few years ago, went through a refurbishment of the building. So I have not been there since. I imagine the amenities are nicer, et cetera. But in terms of the environment, the reason they're this low is what you alluded to. For pretty much the entire period I've been paying attention, so that's a long time, those crowds have tended to be split in terms of most of the games they play there between the Wildcats and whichever school is visiting. Particularly the ones like Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, with large Illinois, Indiana, with large fan bases that also have a lot of alums in Chicagoland. That's a problem when you can't always count on having a decided crowd advantage. It's tough, but I would still rate it ahead of Bryce Jordan because they have occasionally had it be a true home court. And because it's smaller, more intimate, I think it's easier to get to a spot where you could say, okay, this isn't a gimme kind of atmosphere for an opposing team.
Yeah. Well, and there is an atmosphere,
right?
I mean, there's actually some energy.
Yes. Right.
It can turn on you if you're not playing well. Right. I mean, so moving down to number 12, Pinnacle Bank Arena, which is Nebraska. And this is one that, at least on television, I've never been there, but it certainly looks like it has the potential to be a much tougher venue if Nebraska was good.
I agree.
What else are you going to do in Lincoln, but in the winter?
I feel like this is, I'm maybe being a little bit unfair to them. But at some point, you've also got to start factoring in what the success level is, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could say,
Mm-hmm.
well, they get good crowds and they seem to be into it, but the team doesn't win very much. How can you call it a tough venue? And that's
Yeah,
fair.
right.
In Nebraska's case, though, I think you're right. That's a tougher building waiting to happen because they do turn out. It's new, very new, might be the newest in the league, as a matter of fact. I think it is. Um, but they've got to put better teams in there. And when that happens, if and when that happens, then I think you will see them move up this list. Because there are some teams here, there are some buildings rather on this list directly ahead of them that I don't think it would take any more than that to jump them.
No.
Because some of
I
these
agree.
programs have won a lot over time, and yet I've still got them down toward the bottom. That tells you that's probably not likely to change. Nebraska could change if they just get a better product in there.
Well, and I think it's a good example is Rutgers, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you have a
absolutely.
Right? I mean,
except that Nebraska is on a much, much bigger level. It's a much bigger building. The crowds are larger. They could really, I would say this, and this might seem a stretch, but honestly, if they had really, really competitive teams, I could easily see Nebraska becoming something equivalent to like a Kohl Center.
Oh, sure.
I could see that.
I'd buy that. Yeah. Yeah, no question. Well, and then going down to the next on our list, number 11 is Chrysler Center, University of Michigan. This is a place that, I think Michigan's biggest problem, well, aside from the facilities are kind of lousy, is just a lack of commitment really to the basketball program from the athletic department over decades and decades, because even in the 90s with the Fab Five, they weren't selling out the arena. And it's not like it's 50,000 seats, right? It's like a sort of typical size. It's a little smaller than Breslin. It's, I think, 12,000 or 11,000.
That's
like that.
To me, that's the most damning fact about Michigan as a basketball school is with the most hyped or overhyped, depending upon your vantage point, team in my lifetime of watching college basketball, they couldn't consistently sell it out. That's just crazy. And I could tell you as recently as year before last, I was at, unfortunately, because it was a terrible game from an MSU perspective, I've referenced it here often. I was at the MSU game at Chrysler, but the striking thing was I was in the upper bowl and it was, to say it was half full might be generous.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's not like Michigan State is not like, but they are a rival. I mean, you can argue it's not the rival, but certainly basketball.
Oh, basketball it is.
Ohio State. Ohio State, right?
But in basketball, it's clearly Michigan State. It's Ohio State in one sport. Right. That and honestly, if Michigan State had not been hitting the skids at that point in the season, I think there would have been even more MSU fans. Trust me, there were a lot of MSU fans in that building. I was far from alone. And that's also, and I've been to multiple games. I've probably been to 5-6 games at Chrysler over the years. And it's always that way. There are always a bunch of Michigan State fans. Now, that's not that abnormal. You see a lot of Michigan fans at Spartan Stadium, right? That in and of itself is not so damning, but when they can't even come close to filling the building, it says something. I give John Beilein a lot of credit, and I was really hard on him early in his tenure because I just didn't think there were a lot of aspects to the way he was running his program that I didn't think would work. And in fairness to him, he adjusted a lot of those, but look, he proved me wrong. He actually had a very successful tenure, and I think is pretty clearly the best coach they've had in my lifetime. But and I would give him credit for forcing that school to make some adjustments in terms of commitment to the program, what you were mentioning. Like it was under his watch that they did a rehab of Chrysler, and it is better. It's a better experience than it once was. I mean, that place just felt like a dungeon for a long time. Mm-hmm. It was built in the 60s. It got outmoded by, I would say, by the late 80s, early 90s. You could really feel it. And as the 90s went along, that just continued. and he managed to get them to commit. And it's a better, like I said, one of the things they've done, they've changed the lighting. One of the big things he did was something you mentioned a few minutes ago. They don't have a student section on par with the best in the conference. Like the Maze Rage is not as good as the Izzone. It's not as good as the Paint Crew at Purdue or the Orange Crush in Champaign, but it's good, and it's far better than it once was. And I think getting enthusiasm ramped up for that group, and then making sure that, like some of these other places, they get premium seating around the court has helped improve the atmosphere as well. It's hard to rate them any higher than this, though, because I guess one of the ways I look at it is, when you, as a fan of an opposing team, you think about going into these buildings, the parameters I always use are, if they're good, meaning the team hosting you is good, do you have any chance of winning? If they're not good, are you still worried about the game?
Right. Yeah.
And with Michigan, I don't ever feel, and look, you could certainly lose there. I mean, Michigan State, it's been I guess it's been since 19, since Cassius's junior year, since MSU has won there. So that's several losses in a row at Chrysler. But still, I'm going to feel that way, this season going into Chrysler. It's like, that's that's a road game you can get. And that's
right.
And that's their biggest rival, feels that way. So if you're Rutgers or you're Iowa, do you feel like going into Chrysler? Yeah, that's one that at least you don't feel going into it like, hey, we've got no chance. Of course. It just doesn't have that kind of atmosphere to it. Never has. So I can't really, these next few you can debate to some extent, but I do feel justified in putting Chrysler where I've got them.
Yeah, no, I think they are sort of like a Bryce Jordan, but they have some fans,
and they have a lot more tradition and
certainly more success.
Yeah, so you can't discount
which is why they have more fans, and
right.
so they sort of relate to each other for sure.
Do you want to get away with wearing shorts all the time? On the golf course, at work, on a date? Then you need to try Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs are the first shorts that actually look incredible. They have a super trim, tailored fit that look clean enough for you to wear everywhere. The best part is, the fabric is stretchy and super comfortable. But nobody will know, because they look amazing. Go to birddogs.com/pool to grab yours before they sell out for the season. They'll even throw in a free Yeti-style tumbler. That's birddogs.com/pool.
The new Chevy Silverado HD puts you in command. Own strength with its enhanced available Duramax 6.6-liter turbo diesel V8. Own the lake with its available advanced towing technology. And own technology with an available 13.4-inch diagonal touchscreen. The new Chevy Silverado HD. Own work, own play, own life. Learn more at Chevy.com. Find new roads. Chevrolet.
Before we go on to the next grouping, I just want to remind everybody that Nudge Printers, they are a great sponsor of the show. They've been our original sponsor, and so I'd encourage you to check out their stuff. They have some great summer wear that they've lines they brought on with the state of Michigan, going to the beach, and we have also some new stuff for tailgating, because it is not that far before football season begins, and so you want to make sure you get your T-shirts and your other Spartan gear available, cornhole, decals, etc. You can get all of that at nudgeprinting.com. You get 20% off if you enter Final Four into the coupon code. You can get, again, apparel. They have decals for the wall, for cornhole, and just a great selection and great high-quality stuff from some Spartan alums who support the university very well. All right, so make sure you go to Nudge Printing. You won't regret it. Next on the list, as we go to the next grouping, is Value City, which is also the Ohio State Buckeyes. And this is, in some ways, I almost think this is one of the splitting hairs. I almost feel like this one's easier than Chrysler in some respects, just from Michigan State's vantage point. But I don't know. I suppose it always feels like there are some fans there when you watch on TV. I've never been there, but it doesn't feel like it's an overwhelming atmosphere, which is, obviously why it's 10th and not higher in the list.
Yeah, and this is the splitting hairs. If someone were going to argue Chrysler was a better venue than Value City, I wouldn't I wouldn't pick that as a hill to die on. Let's put it that way. Here's the problem for Ohio State. It's two problems, I think. The first is football first school. And that's, you could say that about Michigan too, although I'd never feel like the atmosphere in their football stadium is all that great, considering they got, six figures worth of people in there. But anyway, Ohio State is a football first school. Now they've had a ton of success basketball wise, but it's not a place where I feel like the basketball fan base is passionate. It's engaged. If they're good, they're interested, but it's not passionate. So that sets them below some other programs, right? The other thing is when they built Value City, I have been there, and it feels like a pro building. Everything's just set back a little bit more than in some of the college buildings. I'm talking about even the newer ones like, Breslin or some of these other places. And that doesn't help. I can remember a time as a person of some years where there were a lot of these old field houses in the Big Ten. So Ohio State, St. John's Arena, Wisconsin had a field house. MSU had Jenison, obviously. Iowa had their place. There were a lot of these old buildings, and they just Ohio State, Michigan State, I still maintain I've never been in a louder building than Jenison. When Jenison was hopping, when they were rolling, loudest building for basketball for any sport I've ever been in was Jenison Fieldhouse. But MSU obviously has done a really good job with Breslin at finding a way to make these newer style venues hostile and a great atmosphere. Ohio State has not been able to do that in the same way. It's not bad. It just lacks feel. And again, we go back to student sections. What's the Ohio State student section called?
Is there one?
I don't know that there is either. I was trying to think about that. There's got to be, but I don't, as opposed to, what separates it from a place like Wisconsin, Kohl Center, also a newer era building. Well, Wisconsin has the Grateful Red. That's a good student section. And that kind of leads their crowd, and it's a much more engaged room than what they have at Value City. So I think those are the differences.
So next, moving on to Carver Hawkeye Arena, which is obviously Iowa City.
Williams Arena.
Oh, sorry, Williams Arena. Yeah, sorry, you're right. Number 9, Williams Arena in Minnesota, which is a place that I feel like in the past was harder, partly because Minnesota is better.
100%.
But I feel like they changed the before you sat below the floor.
Yes.
And I feel like it was like a long ways below the floor before.
It was.
And maybe now it's not as dramatic. And I feel like the floor is a little smaller. So I think players had to feel like they're going to fly off, and you're chasing after a ball. You're like going to think twice before you head to the sideline, because you may tumble another 2 feet into the cement floor.
You were playing on a stage, and it's actually, I believe Judd was the first guy to do this, where he just got sick and tired of climbing up to that thing. So he started bringing a stool that he would sit on the raised floor, so he didn't have to keep going up and down. But yeah, you were playing on a stage. And I actually, in junior high, my junior high gym was, they would raise a divider that would come down between the gym and the auditorium. So it wasn't entirely like Williams, but you were literally on a stage. And if you went hard after a ball going out of bounds on the sideline on one side of the court, you could theoretically go flying off a stage. So I know that feeling from personal experience, and it's got to be really frightening when it's the entire court. I've got Williams here basically based on a long timeline, because the reality is in recent years, they haven't been consistently good or good at all in some points. And the crowds aren't what they once were. But I'm telling you, if they manage to put a competitive team back on the court, that building becomes very difficult to win in because it's the only one of its kind left in the league. The RAC is also older, but it's a little different.
Yeah.
Williams Arena is one the last man standing, so to speak, of those old field, those old, like, say 8,000 to 12,000 seat field houses. And
Like Assembly Hall would be the other one too. Maybe?
Assembly Hall is not that old. It's a different building. It's a different kind of building. These are the old brick buildings. That's what they are.
Yeah.
And,
right. Yeah.
And if you've been to, and most of our listeners, or a lot of them I would expect, have been to Jennison at some point in their lives. And it's like that, except I think Williams is a little bigger than Jennison was, if memory serves. But those buildings, man, the acoustics are such that when they get loud, they get really loud. And the crowd is much more on top of you than at some of these newer buildings. So I've seen Williams Arena be great. So I can't put it behind some of these others, even though now, you could argue, is it easier to win a game at Williams Arena than Chrysler? Yeah, in part because they're bad. And in part because they're bad, the crowd isn't as engaged as it used to be. But objectively, I think it's a better arena.
For sure. And I feel like, I still am a little nervous when Michigan State goes to play in Williams Arena, just because of the past long time ago. Clem Haskins. And then I'm like, I have to remind myself, okay, Michigan State's won 10 in a row in Minneapolis.
But that's it. Exactly. If you've been around long enough, you still have that feeling about it.
Right. So now we'll move on to the next one, number 8, which is the Carver Hawkeye Arena in Iowa City. Iowa Hawkeyes. It is, now I've spent a lot of time in this when I was at school at Iowa. So, and I was there during the bad years, and then they got better during Steve Alford, although the crowds are better anyway. It is a really cool arena in that you walk in street level. All the superstructure for the roof and everything for like the holding of the roof up is actually outside on top of the building. So it's a very strange looking building, but you walk in and it's one level. You just walk straight down. The one thing I would say, and it's why it doesn't, I think, rank that highly is, I was mainly a football school primarily, but also the fact that their students, which they're relegated behind the basket and they're not on the floor.
Yep.
At least, and now they may have moved them since then, but they are back a ways. And so I think, to point why you would have students so far away to when you give yourself a home court advantage. I realize they're boosters who pay money and stuff.
That's it.
Gray hairs
that's
and
the
stuff,
that's the tension. That's the tension. But if I were a coach going in to run one of those programs, I would make that kind of thing a non-negotiable point. And look, I understand people, and you see who's got, there was something that Beeline did, for example. My understanding is he kind of forced that to happen, that student section was given better prioritized seating, and it makes a difference.
Yeah. Well, there's no question. And I mean, with Steve Alford, there's still really good crowds that were there. But it's just not the same when you don't have if you have to have a really good team, because if you don't, it can be a bad experience. And that definitely happened for a long time at Iowa with Licklider and those really down years for Iowa. And I still feel like in general, it's not that hard a place to win in, probably, even when I'd say that after Michigan State collapsed last year, but I don't think they struggled that much. And you don't think they're going to Carver Hawk like, oh no, it's going to be really tough to win. Unlike, say, going to Kinnick Stadium, right? Like a totally different experience in the same city.
Yep, I agree.
All right, so we're going to move into the top half now, and next one we've referred to a couple times, the RAC, which is actually no longer the Rutgers Athletic Center. What's it called again now? It's the
Jersey Giant,
Jersey Mike's,
Jersey Mike,
Jersey Mike's, or something like that.
It's the RAC,
arena, right? It's the RAC. Anyway, that has become a venue that was at one time, of course, when Rutgers was winning one game in the Big Ten, or zero. There was not a hard venue, but now it's loud, it's tough, and they're.
Absolutely.
So it's obviously up higher in the list.
Look, and it's, this does, in some instances, this becomes a chicken or the egg kind of thing with, are they good
Totally.
or are they good because the building's good? But I think at Rutgers, you've seen what Steve Pikiell has been able to do in terms of developing that program and consequently turning his home court into a real advantage. It's such a small building that if you get a crowd in there and it's raucous at all, again, the noise level, I've not been there, but I've got to believe it's just very, very difficult to deal with. And, it's more like a high school gym, right? That's what it looks like, as
Yes.
opposed to a Big Ten school arena. But I think it's become a real advantage for Rutgers. The results don't lie. That has become a very difficult place to play in. And so for now, at least, I don't think you can really rank them much lower.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's definitely a place when you see your teams going in there. I think you have a little trepidation that doesn't matter what the Rutgers team is. You're like, well, this is gonna be tough. This is gonna be a tough game because it's a tough place to play. And similar to the next one on the list, which is the Xfinity Center with Maryland, the Terrapins. Again, so they've got a really good basketball tradition, and anyway, that's a tough place to play too, especially when they're starting to hum like they did last year.
It's the thing is the last few years it's gone downhill a bit because there was a lot of dissatisfaction with Mark Turgeon, and they weren't really contending, and I think that is all impacted. But you can remember the early stages of them being in the Big Ten, and certainly the Gary Williams era at Maryland when they were in the ACC, and they were, for a time at least, were a national title contender and actually won one. That's a basketball school. I mean, Maryland, that's a fan base that cares about the sport. And so even though it's more one of these pro style buildings, the difference between them and a place like Value City is I think that fan base, when they're engaged, makes it a very difficult building to win in. So
Yeah,
I've got them there. And, if we were to do this thing 5 years from now and Kevin Willard keeps them on track and they keep getting better, it could even rank higher just because of that fan base as much as anything else.
So now we kind of move into I think the venues that you're every year to year, you think it's going to be a tough place to play. Yeah. And I think you always, and this, we'll start with State Farm, which is where the Fighting Illini play in Champaign. This is a place where I feel like, I don't know how often Michigan State is successful there, but it's well under like 40%. I think it's got to be. They're great fans, and like you said, they have the weird lighting there, yep. And the fans feel like they're right on top of you, yep. And they're into the game. I mean, there's no question. They love their basketball.
These top five, you can debate them, and I wouldn't argue that a different listing is not possible, and totally justifiable. In fact, even as I'm looking at this, as we're discussing it, I'm wondering, God, should I have put them fourth instead of fifth? Because it's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's some recency bias in this because there have been periods over the last 20 years where Illinois wasn't great.
Right.
But that building is. They check every box. It's an older building. Again, it's another one of these goes back to the 60s, but gets loud. They have the dark lighting that in their case, I think helps. It makes it intimidating. And they've got a great, and have for a long time, have had a great student section that's right on top of you. So yeah, it checks all the boxes as a top tier building. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah, and when they're on your schedule, it's a road game. You're going to definitely think.
It's one of those.
Very lucky to come out with the win.
The standard is okay. If they're good, do you think you have any chance to win going in there? And Illinois is a building where if Illinois is really good, no, you probably mark that down as an L going in your mind.
Maybe you steal one, but that's how you look at it, as steal.
And if they're not good, do you still worry about it? And I think usually the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. Another thing there's no question about, if you need help with the gutters, work on your problems with drainage off your roof, you want to get a hold of the brothers that just do gutters. That's all they do. They just do gutters. So if you're in the state of Michigan, on the west side of the state, you can talk to Kurt Stauffer and his team. If you're on the east side of the state, you can talk to Greg and his team. They do fantastic work. They specialize, again, just in gutter work. If you want to take care of those leaves, you want to take care of some leaks, or you have some bad vinyl ones or something like that, you need those replaced or repaired, they can do it. They can do it quickly. It's a very good price. And you're not getting to some guy who just decides to do this on the side. And so these are people who only do the gutters, and they do it in just about any weather. They're kind of crazy in that sense. I think they're out, and like they had mine, they did it in February. So you will not regret going to the Brothers That Adjust Your Gutters. You can find the contact information underneath, but you can also just go to brothersgutters.com and you can set in your zip code and find your area, and you can get a hold of the people, either Greg on the southeast side of the state, around Detroit area, or Kirchhofer on the east side or the west side over by Grand Rapids, Saugatuck, Holland area. All right, so now we'll move into our top 4 here, and we'll start with Kohl Center in Wisconsin. This is a place that was, under Bo Ryan especially, was, to your point, I mean, you never expected ever to win there. If you ever got a one, even if you were competitive, you were happy.
Yep.
Although I guess it was always close because Wisconsin never would run away with the game. But, it was an automatic L for about every year.
Yeah. And again, you can debate this. And if somebody were to say, I think Illinois is a tougher building, I wouldn't say they were wrong definitively. It really is splitting hairs, but they've just been so successful in this place for a quarter century now that you can't, you have to take account of that. Right. From a Michigan State perspective, it's been easier of late. They won at Kohl Center last year. They've won several times actually in the last, 10 years or so. They've had a much, much better run. But they've got a good student section, good crowd. They fill it consistently. And I think though, all those things add up to a tough environment for a road team to come into.
Well, and the number 3 is the school that I think has, their venue is certainly probably the best tradition, or sort of the most storied, I guess, is the Assembly Hall in Bloomington, Indiana for the Hoosiers. It's a place that Michigan State's had some success. I don't feel like you go to Assembly Hall and you're definitely going to lose. But when Indiana's got a good team, they're obviously tough to take down. To your point earlier, if they're a good team, that you're not going to win there. But great place. I've never been there. I've worked with plenty of people who are grads, and they go on and on about Assembly Hall. But also mention just kind of how old it is.
Yeah,
how old it feels.
Yeah. What's weird about Indiana is this to me. I think I would argue it's the most engaged, most passionate fan base in the Big Ten, and right there with any of them in the country. They fill it consistently. So those are all good things. But I think when you're at this level, you have to look for things that can differentiate from one to another, and they can be small things, but in this case, I don't think it's a small thing. When I compare them to Michigan State and Purdue, what they lack is that student section.
Yep, I agree.
They've got one, but it is not anywhere on par with the other two. And I think that does contribute to making that maybe just a little less difficult of an environment to win in than those other buildings.
Wait, I don't even know. I don't feel like I ever see them on TV. Like, I don't even know where they're located. I wonder if they're
exactly, which again,
just
like I said for Ohio State, can you name what's the name of the student section in Indiana? I don't know.
Who's your student? I don't know.
Yeah, it's just not. Yeah, it's not a thing. And some of that probably comes from Bob Knight. I just have a feeling that Bob Knight probably didn't feel something like that was necessary. And so there's not the same, whereas Michigan State has had one going back to Judd, and it's ebbed and flowed as to how engaged people were with it, but there's a long tradition of it. At Indiana, I don't think that existed. And I do think that is a little bit of an advantage for the two that I've got ahead of them.
Well, and then we'll go to number 2, which is Breslin, obviously Michigan State with his own. And this actually brings me to one question. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I was just thinking about this as we're going through this, talking about student sections and the Orange Crush and Pink Crew. I don't recall there being an official student section for Michigan State. I mean, certainly Izzone didn't exist before Tom Izzo was there for a couple of years. But were they around have they always been around where they are, where they're basically circling the entire court outside of like one or two sections?
Izzo made adjustments in terms of where they were seated. Yes.
That changed.
Yes.
Right. and the actual creation of the zone. And then I wonder somewhat if they are sort of the progenitor of the other student sections actually having like identities, like the Paint Crew, like the Orange Crush. Like, did those exist before as entities? Or was Izzone the first one that actually was organized?
No, they wouldn't be the first one. Certainly, and not even the first one at Michigan State. I mean, Michigan State had, I think, two different names. There was one point that they were known as Judd's Jungle, and then for a longer time, I think it was Spartan Spirits, I believe,
Okay.
or what the student groups were called. But it didn't have the same level of identity as the Izzone. I would say, nationally, certainly the Cameron Crazies were a big deal before the Izzone was. But the
I agree,
Izzone
yeah.
was still early in this more modern period of a strong identity and it being something that was so closely connected to the coach and kind of something that he was encouraging actively. All of those things were definitely true. So yeah, I would say the Izzone's not the progenitor of it all, but are they an influence on a lot of places? Yeah, I think that's clearly true.
Like, I know there wasn't one at Michigan, that had any sort of
No,
organized
no.
thing.
Maze Rage came along,
or even
yeah.
Or at Iowa. Even when I was at Iowa in school, there wasn't a Hawk's Nest back then, and so it feels like people wanted to sort of like have a brand for the student sections, and it didn't really exist. I don't feel like until at least recognizable. Like, you'd have the announcers that mentioned it during the game.
Right.
Oh, there's Izzone, right? Or there's the Orange Crush, the Pink Crew.
Right.
Like, they never talked about that before, but again, maybe that's just my memory.
No, I think it's something that
too.
clearly has gained currency. It did exist, as I say, even at Michigan State, it existed, but not to this extent.
Right, not recognizable anyway. Sort of big outward face, yeah. Well, then let's go to the toughest venue, which you have listed as Mackey Arena, which is Purdue University, and I think, to your point earlier, where the venues rank is in some reflection of, how good the teams are, right? Like,
sure.
You go in there, are you just assuming you're going to lose? And Mackey probably hasn't always been number one on the list, but it certainly is now. It's certainly for Michigan State, which
I think that's fair. I mean, there were periods of time where maybe I would have been inclined to think about Cole, or I would have been inclined to think about State Farm when it was Illinois Assembly Hall. Yeah, it definitely changes some over time, but I will tell you this. I've been paying attention and aware of Big Ten basketball since 1977. And for the entirety of that time, Mackey Arena has always been among the toughest places to play. It's never waned. And Purdue's been very good for most of that time. There have been some short periods where they weren't as competitive, but they didn't last long. And even in those years, you still felt nervous going into those places. I mean, you look at it, go back as recently as the year where the tournament got wiped out by COVID. So 1920, Purdue was, if I recall correctly, was right on the precipice of being a tournament team or not. It was hard to know for sure. Did they need to win a Big Ten tournament game to sew it up? It was questionable, right? So not a great Purdue team. Michigan State, Big Ten champs, a team that by the time March rolled around was seen as being as good as anyone in the nation. And MSU went in and got waxed. Just got absolutely run out of that gym. That has happened. And then when Purdue is actually good, God help you. So it's hard for me, if there someone who isn't a Michigan State fan maybe could look at and make a case for Breslin being the best. In part because I'm a Michigan State fan, I can't do it because I can't speak to what it feels like as an opposing fan coming into Breslin, but I sure as hell can what it means to go into Mackey. And so that's why I give Purdue, there's kind of a reverse bias in a way working there. Yeah, I think Breslin has an argument, but the other thing is Mackey has been an incredibly intimidating building for much longer than Breslin. It's another one of these buildings built in the 60s, I believe. And I mean, I go back, like I can remember, I've seen every great Michigan State player you can think of. I've seen get beat, sometimes in heartbreaking fashion and sometimes where they just got pounded. in that building. All of them. You know, Magic saw him get beat by an Arnett Hallman jumper at the buzzer. You know, Scott Skiles, Steve Smith, Sean Respert, Mateen Cleaves. I mean, on and on and on. Cassius Winston, Denzel Valentine, Draymond Green. They've all lost at Mackey. So that's my number one. It wasn't a particularly tough choice at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, that's probably, and just that the fact that it's been that long of tradition is worth something for sure. I guess, the question just for you is, how many of these arenas have you been to? I mean, have you been to half of them at this point?
Yeah, probably about that. Yeah. Yeah. Let me look real quick. 1, 2, Chrysler many times, Welsh Ryan once, Guy City once, yeah, about 5 or 6.
Yeah, I've always thought it'd be kind of fun going to the arenas, but it might be kind of hard to get tickets for some of them.
For some, and it's also, I also don't love going into a game in that situation where I feel like they don't have a chance. Meaning Michigan State and some of these.
Oh, right, going to watch him at Mackey. It's
I don't think that would be fun.
I know I get lots of friends who come and watch their team, come and play at Breslin. They're like, I don't know, just because it's close, it's an hour away. I might as well just go, but
right.
My team's going to lose. And as to your point of sort of the reverse bias, I remember every loss that Michigan State's had at Breslin Center. And so I'm like, oh, this place is not invincible. But then I forget that, they win almost all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, the year before last was a very strange situation where they lost a lot at home,
right.
But for the most part.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. Well, and the other exciting thing about the Breslin Center this year is we're having the seat readjustment. And so that's actually happening this week. And so for those who've been longtime listeners know that I've had problems with a heckler. And so almost for sure, I will not be buying.
Well, maybe he's on the move too. Years. You never know.
You should be positive for me. You should be happy for me.
You guys can be joined at the hip.
If he has the same amount of Spartan points, I'll be so upset at this point. So we're going to try and get onto the other side of the arena. We'll see how things work. It's funny because when you start the reassignment, of course, the entire arena is open. You're like, oh, this is not going to be bad. But by the time it comes to us, I think it's going to be largely filled up. I mean, not large. It'll be a lot filled up. And so then you have to make a decision. Do you want to sit down low or sit up high?
Right.
And then as far as where you're on the sight lines and such. But looking forward to that. It's always exciting to get new people you sit by. And before this guy, the heckler, the last person who drove me crazy was probably 2 adjustments ago. And this woman would just yell all the time in the game, get the re. And I've never heard anyone ever say that in my life. And I don't know why. I just found it so grating, but just say rebound. Or just get the board, whatever. But she would just kept saying, get the re. And I'm like, I don't think anybody says that except you, lady. But anyway, we'll step away now. And again, reminder to continue supporting the show. You can go to the finalfoursnottheschedule.com/support. You can give one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo, or monthly contributions through Patreon. Those are obviously greatly appreciated. If you want to get a hold of us to become a sponsor of the show, you can get a hold of me at eric@tiffnuts.com. And for our great sponsors, visit them. You won't regret it. Nudge Printing, you get 20% off if you enter Final Four at the coupon code, again, nudgeprinting.com, or Brothers Gutters. The Brothers that just do gutters. You can go to brothersgutters.com, get 10% off if you say Final Four to them as well, either Greg on the southeast side or Kurt out on the west side of the state. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.
It's Ram season, which means it's time to serve with Ram 1500, Ram 3500, and Ram TRX. Hurry in now for great deals on the trucks that are built to serve. Right now during Ram season, get 10% below MSRP on the purchase of a 2023 Ram 1500 Laramie. Not compatible with lease offers or with any other consumer incentive offers. Contact dealer for details. Take retail delivery by 5/31/23.